Hey everyone, and welcome to a quick little tutorial on how to use my Raycast displacement baker. So before we get into too much detail and bake out a full character, let's just explain why it's best to use Raycasted displacement over the interpolated subdivision method. So let's just inspect these two meshes here. In the middle here is our high res, and it's extremely sharp, perfectly flat on the surface. Really clean along that edge. And if we look at the base mesh, it's fairly low resolution. Now, when I bake multi-res displacement in Blender, which is the same method that ZBrush uses, you can see that on any sharp edge, it inflates it if the base mesh is too low poly to hold that form. And you can just see that we get really nasty results along any sharp edge. And not only that, it's a bit muddy and it doesn't quite hold that same level of detail as the high res. Another thing to note is that in the displacement modifier that I'm using to load the displacement maps into, I have a strength of 0.12. I'm just eyeballing this because the strength is not baked into the texture map itself. So I'm just guessing what this needs to be, which is not ideal in any pipeline. You don't want someone or yourself, when you're shading it, to be guessing what this value needs to be to replicate the same results as the high res, right? Now let's come down to the raycast and the high res. So this lower one here is the raycasted one. And you can see that, we're getting really nice, clean results. The top is flat. We're maintaining that sharp edge. And while it is slightly softer than the high res, that's just due to the fact that we could have done a higher resolution map and given this an extra subdivision level to capture that sharp edge. But as you can see, it's almost a one-to-one match. And if we come down and look at the displacement modifier, the strength is set to 1. You know that it'll always be 1 because the raycasted 32-bit map actually records the distance that each vertex needs to travel in order to match the high-res detail. So you just get predictable, clean results. Let's go over some more reasons as to why raycast displacement is superior. So the first thing I'm going to show you is that a lot of the time when you're sculpting detail, you're pinching faces, you're squeezing them together to get nice tight forms, and displacement only works up and down. Black is down, white is up. But when you crease and pinch faces together, the vertices are not moving up and down, they're moving side to side as well. And so interpolated subdivision displacements don't know how to record that into a displacement map because it's only looking for up and down information. If you sculpt details just up and down using, for example, the draw sharp brush, that will bake out fine because it's only up and down. Another reason is that in your high res, you have the ability when raycasting to have intersecting faces to capture really sharp details. But the problem with the interpolated subdivision method is that it doesn't know how to interpolate faces overlapping because displacements, again, should only be up and down. But when you're raycasting, you're essentially just taking the low resolution mesh and you're just projecting straight down onto the high res. So even though those faces are intersecting with each other, I'm going to extract this detail perfectly because I don't care about how the subdivisions interpolate. I'm just extracting the detail directly from high to low. And so you can get away with a lot of artifacts that way. And you have a lot more freedom with your sculpting and you get more accurate results using raycasted displacement. So those are the main reasons why you should never use ZBrush's displacement methods or Blender's displacement methods, the vanilla tools. You always want to use some kind of raycasting extraction method, which is why I developed this tool. So let's move on to baking out a full character. All right, let's get started with baking out displacement for a full character here. So I've already isolated all of my multi-res objects here with sculpt data. And I'm just going to rename the collection low. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to first explode the mesh. And the reason for that is because these are all crashing together and the rays are going to hit objects that you don't want them to. So let's just break everything apart. It's down. And even these guys here, we're going to have to move these apart. And even with this guy here, just come with the move brush, just make sure it's not crashing together, like so. Great. Now let's Alt-D, duplicate these instance, sorry. Dump them into a high collection. And the reason I'm instancing is so any changes I make to the low will affect the high. So then I'm just going to increase the subdivision levels of my sculpt data, my multi-res modifiers. So I have all of the nice detail in my model here. Great. Let's hide that collection for now. And we will also need to just get rid of the multi-res modifier on these objects here. So I'm just going to Control A, visual geometry to mesh, and that'll just collapse it down. So we have no modifiers present. Great. Now let's hide that collection. And let's create an object here for our geometry nodes modifier. It could be any object. And it's important that it's not inside of the high or low collection. So let's append that geometry nodes modifier, raycast displacement, attach that to the plane. Again, it doesn't matter what object this is, it's just a container. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply the same material that the low-res objects have. So all of them have the material skin on them. And then I'm also going to apply skin to the object itself. So it's applied to the geometry nodes object, modifier, and low-res geometry. All of them need to be sharing the same shader. Great. Let's link those collections. So low to low, high to high, and we'll just let that process. And it looks nasty because we're getting a whole bunch of spikes, but that's because we haven't dialed in our thresholds yet. So let's just start with the border edge threshold. So to explain this, I'll just hide the geometry nodes for now and reveal the high and low. So what's happening is the detail is the rays are being shot, but they're missing the object, so they're going past. So what this threshold does is it takes your high resolution mesh and it slightly increases it slightly extends the border of any open edge so that the ray has something to hit. We'll just hide them again, bring back the geometry nodes modifier. And I know that a value of 0.01 works for this. And it's always best to start really small and incrementally work your way up to get rid of all of your spikes. Great, so it looks like it's sorted out all of the open edge spikes. We've still got a spike over here on the surface, and this is due to the ray distance threshold. So this is basically the distance the ray shoots off the surface. So right now it's 0, so we should increase this to, again, 0.01 should work pretty well for most cases. Great, no more spike there. And it looks like we're relatively spike-free for now. Let's increase our subdivision levels to 2. And because the highest resolution of the high res was 2, 2 should be enough to capture the resolution. The UV smoothing is also set to keep corners, as this is the most distortion-free UV smoothing technique. But just match whatever your pipeline is using. If you're using any kind of subdivision geometry, keep corners is the best. Great, we're at level 2, and we're capturing all of that detail, and what we see on this object is exactly what the map will produce. Okay, we're seeing some spikes here, so let's investigate that. There's either a problem with your high res or your low res. It could be overlapping faces or something else, but these spikes are good because it's a way of debugging problems. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to disable this modifier, because if I'm going to make any mesh changes with this live, it'll be quite slow. So we'll disable that. And let's bring our low back and inspect this area. And I can see that, yeah, it's very sharp here. And for such a small little detail, that might be causing issues. So let's just sculpt that down a little bit, smooth it out. And we'll just hide that collection again. And we'll reactivate the geometry nodes and inspect the result. Great, no more spikes. Just hide these objects here. All right, now it looks like we're just about ready to bake. So as you can see in the modifier, there's an attribute name, disp. So this is what's been fed from geometry nodes into the shader. So let's create an attribute node, call it disp, feed the color into the surface, and we'll create an image texture, new, and just for time's sake, so I'll just make it 512, disp bake 512.01, 32-bit and tiled, because I'm using 24 UDIMs on this character. There's quite a bit of resolution. So we'll create a new image, set that to non-color, and we'll come up to our image, so disp bake 512, and we'll add 23 UDIMs here, 32-bit. Great. So we'll select the texture, select the object, come to cycles, and in the bake panel, we'll change this to emit and click bake. And we'll come back in a few minutes. All right, so our maps have successfully baked out in well under a minute. And for 24 UDIMs, that's pretty decent. And right away, you can see that it doesn't look like there's any information in these textures. You can kind of see a little bit on this map here, but they all just look black. And the reason for that is because we're working in 32-bit world scale. So, and not only that, but the base mesh was already quite high resolution, so we didn't need to extract out too much information. But as soon as I turn my display device from sRGB to Rec 1886, you can see that it's a bit easier to view the data that's contained within these textures. You'll also notice that it has a mid value of 0. And this is ideal for displacements, because when you're adding and subtracting displacements together, if you're adding two displacements which both have a mid value of 0, 0 plus 0 or 0 minus 0 is 0. So you can maintain the mid value of 0 without inflating your mesh. If you, however, add two displacements together that have a mid value of 0.5, 0.5 plus 0.5 is 1, and you're going to see your whole mesh just inflate. So it's always best practice to ensure that when you're adding and subtracting displacements, that it has a mid value of 0. These values are also dependent on the scale of your object, right? So if you have an extremely small object, like you've done a sculpt on an ant, you may not see any information in these textures, but it will be there. It's the fact that the displacement map is recording how much distance each vertex needs to travel in order to recreate the high res. So if it's an extremely small object, they're going to be really dark values, right? So that's just another explanation about what you're looking at in these textures. And that pretty much summarizes everything. So happy baking. See ya.